Man, this Toy Story spin-off is pretty dark. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2025 horror comedy, The Monkey. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content, like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and even some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Monkey stars Theo James, Christian Convery, and Colin O'Brien, and was directed by Osgood Perkins. Loosely based on the 1980 Stephen King short story of the same name, it tells the story of twin brothers whose lives are changed after finding a deadly cursed toy monkey. I've gotta say, there's just something about going to a Stephen King movie in a Maine theater with a crowd of Mainers that just never gets old. And when the movie is set in Maine, an actual real Maine town in this case, it's even better because there's this collective sense of understanding that falls over the theater. I've been a fan of Stephen King's stories since I was a kid, and even though my overall feelings on the film adaptations are more mixed, I still always look forward to seeing them. Personally, I've found that I tend to like adaptations of his short stories a bit more than the novel adaptations, so I had high hopes for this comedic take on his 1980 short story of the same name. The film definitely makes some changes. There are major character additions, whole new plot lines added, new kills, a completely different ending. Even the monkey itself has been changed, ditching its symbols in favor of a drum. So the question becomes, were these changes a good and necessary thing for making the leap from short story to feature film? Or do they change the inherent nature of the story? Apart from the fact that this is a Stephen King film, it was the premise of The Monkey that really enticed me and earned it a spot on my most anticipated movies of the year list. There's just something so interesting to me about the idea of something as innocuous as a wind-up toy monkey acting as a harbinger of death. This concept of bizarre accidents and gruesome deaths being caused by a toy, and a family finding themselves burdened with this cursed object. It's a fun and unique premise to begin with, but one that touches on deeper ideas like generational trauma and the inevitability and randomness of death. The original short story has a fairly simple plot, but the changes made for the film add additional levels of complexity, resulting in an unnecessarily convoluted story. This adaptation seemed to really want to hammer home the family and generational curse aspects of the story, but the decision to make the protagonist a twin was an odd one. You can still follow the story despite all of the added complexity, but the film relies on so much exposition, and even then, the monkey itself is left largely unexplained within this sea of over-explanation. To be fair, it's unlikely that the majority of this film's target audience are here for the story, or really care if the plot makes much sense or flows together in a logical way. Understandably, people are here for the kills. These might be too ridiculous for some people, or might get old after a while for others, but this is where the film really delivers. Turn the key and see what happens? Ridiculous carnage is what happens. This film features one brutal kill after another, full of significant blood and gore, and yet it's solidly a comedy. How does it manage that? With utter absurdity. There's a ridiculous series of escalating events that lead to each of these crazy accidental deaths in a wild and comedic Final Destination style. It's goofy at times for sure, but the film manages to milk a lot of tension and entertainment from the anticipation leading up to each of the deaths. It's rarely a surprise that any given character dies. You know it's coming, and you have an idea of how it's going to happen based on where they are and what's around them, but the fun comes from seeing the unexpected and absurd way in which they actually go. Some of these deaths utilize digital effects that feel almost intentionally fake-looking for comedic effect, but the practical effects are actually really solid and elicited a number of painfully delighted groans from the audience at my screening. Even though they're on opposite ends of the genre spectrum, horror and comedy are two sides of the same coin and can work really well together. It just takes a bit of finesse to find the right balance. The Monkey has been billed as a horror comedy, and will understandably be considered one by the majority of people, but this film is really a super dark comedy that just so happens to have a lot of gore. Now, I don't mind the lack of scares here. I wasn't expecting any going into this film, but I do wish that this movie had been a bit more consistent. The tone is all over the place here, bouncing between distinct comedic styles. There are even attempts at emotion, with all of the family stuff added to the much simpler source material. But it often falls flat because the film does nothing to make you care about any of these characters, especially during the second half when the twins are adults. Instead, the emotional moments and thematic exposition slow the story down and work to drain the reserves of fun that the absurd deaths help to build up. This is still a very enjoyable movie, thanks to some great components, but the assemblage of all of those pieces just wasn't as balanced or well crafted as it needed to be. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is definitely the kills. These increasingly absurd freak accident deaths are the only parts of this film where the tone feels properly balanced. They're able to take the situational comedy and cover it with blood and gore in a way that's incredibly fun. Some people are definitely going to find this to be a case of diminishing returns, but personally, I loved the morbidly silly anticipation and tension leading up to each Final Destination style death. Pro number 2 is the premise. I'll admit that it always feels like cheating when we're talking about a movie based on a book or short story, because obviously that source material is where the premise comes from. But I feel like I have to mention it because in the case of this film, premise and actual story execution aren't at the same level. The monkey has got a killer premise. Pun fully intended. The idea of a cursed monkey toy that causes freak accidents and death, all the while representing generational trauma? It's a great concept that really fits the bill as horror comedy. But that segues us nicely to the cons, the first of which being the tonal balance, or perhaps more accurately, the tonal imbalance. Horror and comedy can be such a perfect combination, but it doesn't just materialize. It takes some work to craft a combination that properly balances the two. And then when you start to add additional elements like family drama into the mix, it gets even harder. And unfortunately, the tone of this film is all over the place, bouncing from effective dark comedy to tedious emotional sequences and back to quirky regular comedy that just doesn't land. The tone here works well periodically, mostly during the death sequences, but it's kind of slow and mildly unpleasant for much of the rest of the time. The second con is how convoluted the story is. Now, I get it. Taking a short story and adapting it into a film isn't always an even one-to-one process. It's not unusual to need to add a bit of meat to the story or some expanded character development in order to justify a feature film-length runtime. The monkey short story has a fairly simple plot, but this film adaptation gets a bit extreme with the changes it makes. Not much remains of that short, other than 2 characters and the basic premise of a monkey toy being associated with death. Change like this, in and of itself, isn't really the issue, so much as the unnecessary complexity added to the story as a result of the change. The changes and additions here, especially the decision to make Hal a twin, completely alter the nature and direction of the story, making it so involved that the plot doesn't make a whole lot of sense after a while. I realize that logical plot progression isn't much of a priority in a film like this, but the added story convolution requires that a lot be explicitly told to the audience through exposition, so it just feels clunky. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying The Monkey or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy in one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give The Monkey 3 out of 5 paws. This is a film that started off much higher for me and progressively dropped down, especially during the third act. The convoluted story and wildly shifting tone negatively impact this film, but the killer premise and absurd, morbidly entertaining death sequences still ensure that this remains an enjoyable film. To the right audience. I would recommend The Monkey to people looking for a fun and morbidly ridiculous film. This movie's billed as a horror comedy, but if you're looking for scares, you're probably going to be a bit underwhelmed. This is honestly more of a gory, dark comedy than it is a traditional horror comedy. This film is quite different from Stephen King's short, but if you don't mind some story inconsistencies and can handle the wild tonal swings, this could prove to be a very enjoyable movie for you. If you liked The Monkey, I would recommend Final Destination 2. Really, any of the Final Destinations are fitting here, and the first 3 are especially good, but this second film really nails the entertaining, anticipatory dread the series is known for, and has some more escalating and elaborately absurd deaths. If you want another ridiculous and gory horror comedy that's a little bit better at balancing tone, you should check out Cocaine Bear, which is exactly what you think it is based on the title. It too has some entertainingly ridiculous kills, and coincidentally also features Christian Convery as a kid who finds himself in an unbelievable situation. If you'd rather your horror remain toy-based, you'll want to watch Annabelle Comes Home. The third film in the Annabelle series, this story focuses on Ed and Lorraine's young daughter, who finds herself trapped in a supernatural nightmare as the Annabelle doll awakens and unleashes several other evil spirits from the Warrens' artifact room. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Monkey? If so, what did you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite film adaptation of a Stephen King short story? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.